Chapter 13, showing how Passepartout perceives once again that fortune favours the brave. The project was a difficult one and a bold, almost impossible to carry out. Mr. Fogg was about to risk his life, or at least his liberty, and consequently the success of his undertaking, but nevertheless he hesitated not a moment. Besides, he found in Sir Francis Cromarty a sturdy ally. Passepartout also was at their disposal. He was quite ready, and his opinion of his master was rising every moment. He possessed a heart, after all, beneath that cold exterior. Passepartout was beginning to love Mr. Fogg. The guide remained. What course would he take in this business? He would probably side with the natives. At any rate, if he would not assist, his neutrality must be assured. Sir Francis put the question to him plainly. "Your Honour," replied the man, "I am a Parsee. The woman is a Parsee also. You may dispose of me as you wish." "Good," replied Sir Francis. "But," continued the guide, "you must remember that not only do we risk our lives in this affair, but we may be horribly tortured if we are taken alive. So take care." "We have made up our minds to run the risk," said Mr. Fogg. "I think we had better wait till nightfall before we act." "I think so too," said the guide, who then proceeded to give his employers some information respecting the lady. He said she was a Parsee, a celebrated Indian beauty, daughter of one of the richest merchants in Bombay. She had received a complete English education. Her manners and tastes were all European. Her name was Alda. She was, moreover, an orphan, and had been married against her will to the Rajah. She had only been 3 months wed. Knowing the fate that awaited her, she had attempted to escape, but was immediately retaken, and the Rajah's relatives, who were desirous from motives of interest for her death, had devoted her to the suit which now appeared inevitable. These particulars only served to confirm Mr. Fogg and his companions in their generous resolve. It was then decided that the guide should take them as near to the pagoda as possible without attracting attention. In about half an hour, the elephant was halted in the brushwood about 500 yards from the temple, which was not visible, but the shouts of the fanatics were distinctly audible. The best manner of releasing the intended victim was then discussed. The guide was acquainted with the pagoda in which he declared the young woman was imprisoned. Was it possible to enter by one of the doors when all the band of priests were wrapped in a drunken sleep, or should they enter through a hole in the wall? This could only be described when they reached the pagoda. But one thing was very certain, and that was that the deed must be done at night and not at daybreak, when the victim was being led to the sacrifice. Then human aid would be powerless to save her. So the party waited till night. At about 6 o'clock in the evening it would be dark, and then they would make a reconnaissance. The last cries of the fakirs would by that time be hushed. The Hindus would by that time, according to custom, be wrapped in the intoxicating arms of bhang, liquid opium mixed with hemp, and it would be possible to glide past them into the temple. The whole party, guided by the Parsee, then advanced stealthily through the forest. After 10 minutes creeping beneath the branches of the trees, they reached the rivulet, whence, by the glare of the torches, they were enabled to distinguish the funeral pyre, composed of the fragrant sandalwood and already saturated with perfumed oil. Upon this pile lay the dead body of the deceased prince, which was to be buried with his widow. 100 paces from the pyre was the pagoda, the minarets of which uprose beyond the tops of the surrounding trees. "Come on," whispered the guide. With increasing caution, the Parsi, followed by his companions, glided silently amongst the tall grasses. The murmur of the breeze through the trees was the only sound that broke the silence. The Parsi soon halted on the border of the clearing. Some torches lit up the space. The ground was covered with groups of tipsy sleepers and bore a great resemblance to a battlefield strewn with dead bodies. Men, women, and children lay all together. Some drunken individuals still staggered about here and there. In the background, the temple loomed amid the thick trees. But greatly, to the disappointment of the guide, armed Rajputs kept watch by torchlight upon the doors, in front of which they paced up and down with naked swords. No doubt the priests within were equally vigilant. The Parsi advanced no farther. He perceived at once that it was impossible to force an entrance to the temple, and he led his companions back again. Sir Francis and Mr. Fogg also understood that no more could be done in that direction. They stopped and consulted together in undertones. "Let us wait a little," whispered the brigadier. "It is only 8 o'clock. Those sentries may go to sleep later." "That is possible, certainly," said the Parsi. So they all lay down under the trees and waited. The time passed very slowly. At intervals, the guide would go forward and reconnoitre. But the guards were always there. The torches burned brightly still, and an uncertain glimmer penetrated through the windows of the temple from the inside. They waited until nearly midnight. There was no change in the situation. The sentries were sleepless, and it became evident that they intended to keep watch all night. They were probably quite sober. It now became necessary to try another plan and to cut through the walls of the pagoda. There was then the chance of finding the priests awake inside, watching their intended victim as closely as the soldiers guarded the door. After a final consultation, the guide expressed himself ready to proceed. Mr. Fogg, Sir Francis, and Passepartout followed. They made a long detour with the intention of approaching the pagoda from behind. About 12:30, they gained the walls without having encountered anyone. Evidently no watch was kept at the sides, but it was equally evident that there was neither window nor door at the back. The night was dark. The moon, then in her last quarter, appeared scarcely above the horizon and was covered frequently by thick clouds. The trees also served to render the darkness more profound. It was enough to have reached the wall. An opening must be discovered or made. To accomplish this, Mr. Fogg and his companions had nothing but their pocket knives. Fortunately, the temple walls were only composed of bricks and wood, which would not be very hard to cut through. Once the first brick had been taken out, the rest was easy. They set about the work immediately and as noiselessly as possible. The Parsi and Passepartout worked away to loosen the bricks in a space about 2 feet wide. The labour was continued, and they were getting on capitally, when a cry was heard from the interior of the temple and was immediately succeeded by others from the outside. Passepartout and the guide ceased working. Had they been heard, and had the alarm been given? Common prudence necessitated a retreat, which was effected in company with Sir Francis Cromarty and Phileas Fogg. They ensconced themselves again beneath the trees to wait until the alarm, if it were an alarm, had subsided, and ready in that event to resume their operations. But alas, the guards now completely surrounded the pagoda and prevented all approach. It would be difficult to depict the disappointment of these 4 men at this unfortunate contretemps. As they were prevented from approaching the victim, how could they hope to save her? Sir Francis Cromarty clenched his hands. Passepartout was almost beside himself, and even the guide had some difficulty in preserving his self-restraint. The impassible Phileas Fogg alone preserved his equanimity. "I suppose we may as well go away now," whispered Sir Francis Cromarty. "That's all we can do," the guide assented. "Don't be in a hurry," said Mr. Fogg. "It will suit me well enough if we reach Allahabad at midday." "But what do you expect to do if we remain here?" said Sir Francis. "It will be daylight in a couple of hours, and we may get a chance at the last moment." The Brigadier would have liked to have been able to read the expression of Mr. Fogg's face. What was he thinking about, this cool-headed Englishman? Would he, at the last moment, throw himself upon the burning pile and snatch her from the clutches of her executioners openly? Such a proceeding would have been the height of folly, and no one could for a moment imagine that Mr. Fogg was so foolhardy as that. Nevertheless, Sir Francis consented to wait the denouement of this terrible scene. But the guide led the party to the edge of the clearing, where, from behind a thicket, they could observe all the proceedings. Meanwhile, Passepartout had been hatching a project in his busy brain, and at last the idea came forth like a flash of lightning. His first conception of the notion he had repudiated as ridiculously foolish, but at length he began to look upon the project as feasible. "It is a chance," he muttered, "but perhaps the only one with such bigoted idiots." At any rate, he wriggled himself to the end of the lowest branch of a tree, the extremity of which almost touched the ground. The hours passed slowly on, and at length some faint indications of day became visible in the sky. But it was still quite dark in the neighbourhood of the pagoda. This was the time chosen for the sacrifice. The sleeping groups arose as if the resurrection had arrived. The tom-toms sounded, chants and cries were once more heard. The sublime moment had come. Just then the doors of the pagoda were opened, and a strong light flashed out from the interior. The victim could be perceived being dragged by two priests to the door. It appeared to the spectators that the unhappy woman, having shaken off the effects of her enforced intoxication, was endeavouring to escape from her executioners. Sir Francis Cromarty was deeply agitated, and seizing Mr. Fogg's hand convulsively, he perceived that the hand grasped an open knife. The crowd now began to move about. The young woman had been again stupefied with hemp fumes, and passed between the lines of fakirs who escorted her, uttering wild cries as they proceeded. Phileas Fogg and his companions followed on the outskirts of the crowd. 2 minutes later they reached the bank of the stream and stopped about 50 paces from the funeral pyre upon which the corpse was extended. In the dim religious light they could perceive the outline of the victim close beside her deceased husband. A lighted torch was then quickly applied to the pile of wood which, saturated with oil, was instantly in a blaze. Sir Francis Cromarty and the guide had to exert all their strength to retain Mr. Fogg, who, in his genius indignation, appeared about to rush upon the blazing pile. But just as Phileas Fogg had succeeded in throwing them off, a change came on the scene. A cry of terror rose from the natives, and they bowed themselves to the earth in indescribable terror. The old Rajah was not dead after all. There he was standing upright upon the fiery funeral pile, clasping his young wife in his arms, ready to leap from amid the smoke into the midst of the horror-stricken crowd. The fakirs, the guards, the priests were all seized with superstitious fear and lay faces to the earth, not daring to lift their eyes to behold such a stupendous miracle. The resuscitated man was thus practically quite close to the place where Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty were standing with the guide. "Let us be off," exclaimed the spectre. It was only Passepartout who had, unperceived, gained the pyre under the cover of the smoke and had rescued the young lady from certain death. It was Passepartout himself who, thanks to his happy audacity, was enabled to pass unharmed through the terrified assemblage. In an instant, the four friends had disappeared in the woods, and the elephant was trotting rapidly away. But very soon, the loud cries and the clamour that arose told them that the trick had been discovered, and a bullet whizzed by as an additional confirmation. For there upon the blazing pile lay the Raja's corpse, and the priests quickly understood that a rescue had been so far successfully accomplished. They immediately dashed into the forest, accompanied by the soldiers, who fired a volley, but the fugitives had got away, and in a few moments more were out of reach of both arrows and bullets. Chapter 14, in which Phileas Fogg descends the charming valley of the Ganges without noticing its beauties. The rash attempt had proved successful. An hour later, Passepartout was laughing at the result of his venturous plan. Sir Francis Cromarty had shaken hands with him. His master had said, "Well done," which from him was high commendation indeed, to which expressions of approbation Passepartout had relied that all the credit of the affair belonged to his master. His own share in it had been an absurd notion after all, and he laughed again when he thought that he, Passepartout, the ex-gymnast, the ex-sergeant of the fire brigade, had actually played the part of spouse of a beautiful young lady, the widow of an embalmed Raja. As for the young lady herself, she was still insensible and quite unconscious of all that was passing or had lately passed. Wrapped up in a railroad rug, she was now reclining in one of the howdahs. Meanwhile, the elephant, guided with unerring care by the Parsi, was progressing rapidly through the still gloomy forest. After an hour's ride, they arrived at an extensive plain. At 7 o'clock, they halted. The young lady was still quite unconscious. The guide poured some brandy down her throat, but she remained insensible for some time afterwards. Sir Francis Cromarty, who was aware that no serious evil effects supervened from the inhalation of the fumes of hemp, was in no way anxious about her. But if her restoration to consciousness was not a subject of anxiety to the brigadier, he was less assured respecting her life in the future. He did not hesitate to tell Mr. Fogg that if Madame Aouda remained in India, she would sooner or later be taken by her would-be executioners. Those fanatics were scattered everywhere through the peninsula, and there was not a doubt that, despite the English police, the Hindus would claim their victim, no matter in what presidency she might endeavour to take refuge. And in support of his assertion, Sir Francis instanced a similar case which had recently taken place. His opinion, therefore, was that she would only be in absolute safety when she quitted India forever. Mr. Fogg replied that he would consider the matter and give his opinion later. About 10 o'clock, the guide announced that they were close to Allahabad. Then they would be able to continue their journey by the railroad, and in about 24 hours they would reach Calcutta. Phileas Fogg would in that case be in time to catch the Hong Kong steamer, which was to sail at noon on the 25th of October. The young woman was safely bestowed in a private waiting room, while Passepartout was hurriedly dispatched to purchase various necessary articles of clothing, etc., for her use. His master supplied the funds for the purpose. Passepartout hastened away and ran through the streets of Allahabad, the City of God, one of the most sacred cities of India, inasmuch as it is built at the junction of the two holy streams of the Ganges and the Jamna, whose waters attract pilgrims from every part of the peninsula. We are also told that the Ganges has its source in heaven, whence, owing to the influence of Brahma, it condescends to earth. While he made his purchases diligently, Passepartout did not forget to look about him and see something of the city. It was at one time defended by a splendid fort, which has since become the state prison. Commerce and business no longer occupy their former places in Allahabad. Vainly did the worthy European seek for such emporiums as he would have met in Regent Street. He could find nothing better than the shop of an old Jew clothesman, a crusty old man he was too. From him he purchased the tweed dress, a large cloak, and a magnificent otter-skin pelisse, which cost £75. With these garments he returned in triumph to the railway station. Mrs. Alder had by that time partly recovered consciousness. The influence of the drug administered by the priests was parting away by degrees, and her bright eyes were once again resuming their soft and charming Indian expression. The poet king, Yukaf Adul, celebrating the charms of the queen of Ahantnagara, thus sings, her shining locks, parted in the centre of her forehead, set off the harmonious contours of her white and delicate cheeks, all glowing in their freshness. Her ebony brows have the shape and power of the bow of Kama, the god of love, and beneath her silken lashes, her dark eyes swim in liquid tenderness, as in the sacred lakes of the Himalayas is reflected the celestial light. Her glittering, even, pearl-like teeth shine between the smiling lips as the dewdrops in the half-closed petals of the passion flower. Her tiny ears, with curves divine, her small hands, her little feet, tender as the buds of lotus, sparkle with the pearls of Ceylon and the dazzling diamonds of the famed Golconda. Her rounded, supple waist, which hand may circle round, displays the curving outline of the hips and swelling bosom, where youth in all its loveliness expands in perfect treasures. Beneath the tunic folds, the limbs seem formed within a silver mould by the godlike hand of Vikvarkania, the immortal sculptor. Without exactly comparing Mrs. Alder with the foregoing description, it may be stated that she was a most charming woman, in the fullest acceptation of the term. She spoke English with fluency and purity, and the guide had only stated the truth when he had averred that the Parsi lady had been transformed by her education. The train was about to start. Mr. Fogg was paying the Parsi guide his hire as agreed, not a farthing in excess. This business-like arrangement rather astonished Passepartout, when he recalled all they owed to the guide's devotion. In fact, the Parsi had risked his life voluntarily by engaging in the affair at Pilaji, and if he should be caught by the Hindus, he would very likely be severely dealt with. There was still Kioni, however. What was to be done with the elephant, which had cost so much? But Phileas Fogg had already made up his mind on that point. "Parsi," said he to the guide, "you have been most useful and devoted to us. I have paid for your services, but not for your devotion. Would you like to have the elephant? If so, he is yours." The eyes of the guide sparkled. "Your honour is giving me a fortune," he exclaimed. "Take him," replied Mr. Fogg, "and then I shall still be in your debt." "Hurrah!" cried Passepartout. "Take him, my friend. Kioni is a fine animal," and going up to the beast, he gave him some pieces of sugar, saying, "Here, Kioni, take this and this." The elephant gave vent to some grunts of satisfaction, and then, seizing Passepartout by the waist with his trunk, he lifted him up. Passepartout, not in the least afraid, continued to caress the animal, which replaced him gently on the ground, and to the pressure of the honest Kioni's trunk, Passepartout responded with a kindly blow. Some short time after, Phileas Fogg, Sir Francis Cromarty, and Passepartout were seated with Miss Alder, who occupied the best place in a comfortable compartment of the train, which was speeding towards Benares. This run of 80 miles from Allahabad was accomplished in 2 hours, and in that time the young lady has quite recovered from the drugs she had inhaled. Her astonishment at finding herself in the train, dressed in European garments and with 3 travellers utterly unknown to her, may be imagined. Her companions in the first place showed her every attention, even to the administration of a few drops of liquor, and then the general told her what had happened. He particularly dwelt upon the devotedness of Phileas Fogg, who had risked his life to save hers, and upon the termination of the adventure of which Passepartout was the hero. Mr. Fogg made no remark whatever, and Passepartout looked very bashful, and declared it was not worth speaking of. Mrs. Alder thanked her deliverers effusively by tears at least as much as by her words. Her beautiful eyes, even more than her lips, expressed her gratitude. Then her thoughts flew back to the suttee, and as she remarked she was still on Indian territory, she shuddered with horror. Phileas Fogg, guessing her thoughts, hastened to reassure her and quietly offered to escort her to Hong Kong, where she could remain till the affair had blown over. This offer the lady most gratefully accepted, for, curiously enough, a relative of hers, a Parsi like herself, was then residing at Hong Kong, and was one of the principal merchants of that British settlement. At 12:30, the train stopped at Benares. Brahmin legends state that this town is built upon the site of the ancient Kusi, which was at one time suspended between heaven and earth, like Mohammed's coffin. But in these practical days, Benares, which Orientals call the Athens of India, rests prosaically upon the ground, and Passepartout caught many a glimpse of brick houses and numerous clay huts, which gave the place a desolate appearance without any local colour. Sir Francis Cromarty had now reached his destination. The troops he was to command were encamped a few miles to the north of the town. He took farewell of Phileas Fogg, wished him every success, and expressed a hope that he would continue his journey in a more profitable and less original manner. Mr. Fogg gently pressed his companion's hand. Mrs. Alder was more demonstrative. She could not forget what she owed to Sir Francis Cromarty. As for Passepartout, he was honoured with a hearty shake of the General's hand, and was much impressed thereby. So they parted. From Benares, the railway traverses the valley of the Ganges. The travellers had many glimpses of the varied country of Bihar, the hills covered with verdure, and the succession of barley, wheat, and cornfields, jungles full of alligators, neat villages, and thick forests. Elephants and other animals were bathing in the sacred river, as were also bands of Hindus of both sexes who, notwithstanding the advanced season of the year, were accomplishing their pious ablutions. These devotees were declared enemies of Buddhism and were strict Brahmins, believing in Vishnu, the sun god, Shiva, the personification of nature, and Brahma, the head of priests and rulers. But how do Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu regard India, now completely anglicized, with hundreds of steamers darting and screaming along the holy waters of the Ganges, frightening the birds and beasts and faithful followers of the gods dwelling along the banks? The landscape passed rapidly by and was occasionally hidden by the stream. The travellers could now discern the fort of Chana, 20 miles southwest of Benares. Then Ghazipur and its important rose-water manufactories came in sight. Then they caught a glimpse of the tomb of Lord Cornwallis, which rises on the left bank of the river. Then the fortified town of Buxar, Patna, the great commercial city and principal opium market of India, Monghir, a European town as English as Manchester or Birmingham, with its foundries, factories, and tall chimneys vomiting forth volumes of black smoke. Night fell, and still the train rushed on in the midst of the roaring and growling of wild animals which fled from the advancing locomotive. Nothing could, of course, then be seen of those wonders of Bengal, Golconda, the ruins of Gom, and Morshabad, Burdwan, the ancient capital, Hooghly, Chandernagore, in French territory where Passepartout would have been glad to see his country's ensign. At last, at 7 o'clock in the morning, they reached Calcutta. The steamer for Hong Kong was not to leave till midday, so Phileas Fogg had still 5 hours to spare. According to his journal, he was due at Calcutta on the 25th October, 23 days from London, and at Calcutta he was as arranged. He had neither gained nor lost so far. Unfortunately, the 2 days he had to spare he spent, as we have seen, while crossing the peninsula, but we must not suppose that Phileas Fogg regretted his actions for a moment. Chapter 15, in which the bag of banknotes is lightened by some thousands of pounds more. Passepartout was the first to alight from the train. Mr. Fogg followed and helped out his fair companion. Phileas had counted upon proceeding directly to the steamer so as to settle Mrs. Alder comfortably on board. He was unwilling to leave her so long, as she was on such dangerous ground. As Mr. Fogg was leaving the station, a policeman approached him and said, "Mr. Phileas Fogg, is it not?" "It is," replied Phileas. "And this is your servant," continued the policeman, indicating Passepartout. "Yes. Will you be so good as to follow me?" Mr. Fogg did not appear in the least degree surprised. The policeman was a representative of the law, and to an Englishman, the law is sacred. Passepartout, like a Frenchman, wanted to argue the point, but the policeman touched him with his cane, and his master made him a sign to obey. "This young lady can accompany us?" said Mr. Fogg. "Certainly," replied the policeman. Mr. Fogg, Mrs. Alder, and Passepartout were then conducted to a palkigari, a sort of four-wheeled carriage holding 4 people, and drawn by 2 horses. They drove away, and no one spoke during the 20 minutes' drive. The carriage passed through the Black Town, and then through the European quarter, which, with its brick houses, well-dressed people, and handsome equipages, presented a marked contrast to the native town. The carriage stopped before a quiet-looking house, which, however, did not appear to be a private mansion. The policeman directed his prisoners, for so we may term them, to alight, and conducted them to a room, the windows of which were barred. "At 8:30, he said, "you will be brought before Judge Obadiah." He then went out and locked the door. "So we are prisoners?" exclaimed Passepartout, dropping into a chair. Mrs. Alder, turning to Mr. Fogg, said tearfully, "Oh, sir, pray do not think of me any longer. It is on my account that you have been arrested. It is for having saved me." Phileas Fogg calmly replied that such a thing was not possible. It was quite out of the question that they could be arrested on account of the suttee. The complainants would not dare to present themselves. There must be some mistake, and Mr. Fogg added that in any case he would see the young lady safe to Hong Kong. "But the steamer starts at 12 o'clock, said Passepartout. "We shall be on board before that," replied the impassible Fogg. This was said so decidedly that Passepartout could not help muttering, "That's all right then, we shall be on board in time, no doubt." But in his soul, he was not so very certain of it. At 8:30, the door opened. The policeman entered and conducted the friends into an adjoining room. This was the court, and was pretty well filled by Europeans and natives. The 3 companions were allotted seats on a bench lacing the magistrate's desk. Judge Obadiah, followed by the clerk, entered almost immediately. He was a fat, round-faced man. He took down a wig from a nail and put it on. "Call the first case," he began, but immediately putting his hand to his head, he said, "This is not my wig." "The fact is, Your Honour, it is mine," replied the clerk. "My dear Mr. Oysterpuff, how can you expect a judge to administer justice in a clerk's wig?" The exchange was made. All this time, Passepartout was boiling over with impatience, for the hands of the clock were getting on terribly fast towards noon. "Now then, the first case," said the judge. "Phileas Fogg," called out the clerk. "Here I am." "Passepartout?" "Here." "Good," said the judge. "For 2 days we have been awaiting you." "But of what do you accuse us?" cried Passepartout impatiently. "You are going to hear," said the judge quietly. "Your Honour," said Mr. Fogg, "I am a British citizen, and I have the right—" "Have you not been properly treated?" asked the judge. "Oh yes, but very well then. Call the plaintiffs." As the judge spoke, the door opened and 3 Hindu priests were introduced by the usher. "It is that, after all," muttered Passepartout. "Those are the fellows that wanted to burn our young lady." The priests stood erect before the judge, and the clerk read aloud the complaint of sacrilege against Phileas Fogg and his servant, who were accused of having defiled a place consecrated to the Brahmin religion. "You hear the charge," said the judge to Phileas Fogg. "Yes, Your Honour," replied the accused, looking at his watch. "And I confess it." "You admit it?" "I admit it, and I wait to see what these priests in their turn will confess respecting their doings at the pagoda of Pillaji." The priests looked at each other. They evidently did not understand the reference. "Of course," cried Passepartout impetuously, "at the pagoda of Pillaji, where they were about to burn their victim." The priests looked stupefied, and the judge was almost equally astonished. "What victim?" he asked. "To burn whom? In Bombay?" "Bombay!" exclaimed Passepartout. "Of course, we are not talking of the pagoda of Pillaji, but of the pagoda of Malabar Hill at Bombay. And as a proof," added the clerk, "here are the shoes of the profaner of the temple," and he placed a pair of shoes upon the desk as he spoke. "My shoes?" exclaimed Passepartout, who was surprised into this incautious admission. One can imagine the confusion which ensued. The incident at the pagoda in Bombay had been quite forgotten by both master and man, and it was on account of that they were both detained. The detective Fix had seen at once the advantage he could derive from that contretemps, so, delaying his departure for 12 hours, he consulted with the priests at Malabar Hill and had promised them a large reward, knowing very well that the English government would punish with extreme severity any trespass of such a description. Then he had sent the priests by train on the track of the offenders. Owing to the time spent by Phileas Fogg and his party in releasing the young widow from the suttee, Fix and the Hindu priests had reached Calcutta first, but in any case, Mr. Fogg and his servant would have been arrested as they left the train in consequence of a telegraphic dispatch which had been forwarded to Calcutta by the authorities. The disappointment of Fix may be imagined when he heard on his arrival that Fogg had not reached Calcutta. He thought that his victim had stopped at one of the intermediate stations and had taken refuge in the southern provinces. For 24 hours, Fix had restlessly paced the railway station at Calcutta. What was his joy when, that very morning, he perceived his man descending from the train in company with a lady whose presence he could not account for. He had immediately directed a policeman to arrest Mr. Fogg, and that is how the whole party came to be brought before Judge Obadiah. If Passepartout had been less wrapped up in his own business, he would have noticed the detective seated in the corner of the court, watching the proceedings with an interest easy to be understood, for at Calcutta, as heretofore, he still wanted the warrant to arrest the supposed thief. But Judge Obadiah had noticed the avowal which Passepartout would have given the world to recall. "So the facts are admitted," said the judge. "They are," replied Fogg coldly. "Well," continued the judge, "inasmuch as the English law is intended to protect rigorously and without distinction all religions in India, and as this fellow Passepartout has confessed his crime and is convicted of having violated with sacrilegious feet the pagoda of Malabar Hill at Bombay during the day of the 20th of October, the said Passepartout is condemned to 15 days imprisonment and to pay a fine of £300. £300? Exclaimed Passepartout, who was scarcely conscious of anything but the amount of the fine. Silence! Shouted the usher, and, continued the judge, seeing that it is not proved that this sacrilege was connived at by the master, but as he must be held responsible for the acts and deeds of his servant, the said Phileas Fogg is sentenced to 8 days' imprisonment and a fine of £150. Usher, call the next case. Fix, in his corner, rubbed his hands to his satisfaction. Phileas Fogg detained 8 days at Calcutta. This was fortunate. By that time, the warrant would have arrived from England. Passepartout was completely dumbfounded. This conviction would ruin his master. His wager of £20,000 would be lost, and all because he, like an idiot, had gone into that cursed pagoda. But Phileas Fogg was as cool and collected as if he were in no way concerned in the matter. At the moment the usher was calling on the next cause, Phileas rose and said, I offer bail. That is within your rights, said the judge. Fix's blood ran cold, but he revived again when he heard the judge say that as the prisoners were strangers, a bail of £1,000 each would be necessary. So it would cost Mr. Fogg £2,000 if he did not put in an appearance when called upon. I will pay the money now, said that gentleman, and from the bag which Passepartout still held, he drew banknotes for £2,000 and placed them on the clerk's desk. This sum will be restored to you when you come out of prison, said the judge. Meantime, you are free on bail. Come along, said Phileas Fogg to his servant. But I suppose they will give back my shoes, said Passepartout angrily. They gave him back his shoes. They have cost us pretty dearly, he muttered. More than £1,000 apiece, without counting the inconvenience to myself. And with the most hang-dog appearance, Passepartout followed his master, who had offered his arm to the young lady. Fix was still in hopes that his prey would not abandon such a sum as £2,000, so he followed Mr. Fogg closely. Phileas took a fly, and the whole party were driven down to the quays. Half a mile from the pier, the Rangoon was moored, the Blue Peter at the masthead. 11 o'clock was striking, so Mr. Fogg had an hour to spare. Fix saw him put off in a boat with Mrs. Alder and his servant. The detective stamped with rage. The rascal, he exclaimed. He is going then. £2,000 sacrificed. He is as reckless as a thief. I will follow him to the end of the world if necessary. But at the rate he is going, the stolen money will soon be spent. The detective was not far wrong. In fact, since he had left London, what with travelling expenses, tips, the money paid for the elephants, in fines, and in bail, Phileas Fogg had already disbursed more than £5,000, so that the percentage upon the sum likely to be recovered by the detective, as he imagined, was growing small by degrees and beautifully less. Chapter 16. Fix does not at all understand what is said to him. The Rangoon, one of the P&O Company vessels plying between India, China, and Japan, was an iron screw steamer of about 1,770 tons, with engines of 400 horsepower. She was as fast but not so comfortable as the Mongolia, and Mrs. Alder was scarcely as well accommodated as Phileas Fogg would have wished. But as the voyage was only 3,500 miles, that is to say, 11 or 12 days steaming, and the young lady was not difficult to please, it was no great matter. During the first portion of the voyage, she became well acquainted with Phileas Fogg, and gave expression to her great gratitude on every occasion. That phlegmatic gentleman listened to her protestations with the most unmoved exterior. Not an expression, not a movement evidenced the slightest emotion, but he took care that the young lady should want for nothing. He saw her at certain hours every day, if not to talk, at least to listen to her conversation. He exhibited towards her the greatest politeness, but the politeness of an automaton. Mrs. Alder did not know what to think of him, though Passepartout had given her a few hints about his eccentric master, and had told her of the wager about going round the world. Mrs. Alder had rather ridiculed the idea, but after all, did she not owe him her life? And Mr. Fogg would not lose by being regarded through the glasses of gratitude. Mrs. Alder confirmed the Parsi guide's explanation of her past history. She was, in fact, of the highest native caste. Many Parsi merchants had made great fortunes in cotton in India. One of them, Sir Jamsetji Jejeebhoy, has been made a baronet by the English government, and Mrs. Alder was connected with this personage, who was then living in Bombay. It was a cousin of his whom she hoped to join at Hong Kong, and with whom she trusted to find protection. She could not say whether she would be received or not, but Mr. Fogg told her not to trouble herself, as all would come mathematically square. These were the words he used. It was uncertain whether the young lady quite understood him. She fixed her great eyes, those eyes as limpid as the sacred lakes of the Himalayas, upon him, but Mr. Fogg was as impassive as ever, and did not show any disposition to throw himself into those lakes. The first portion of the voyage passed very pleasantly. Everything was favourable. The Rangoon soon sighted the great Andaman, with its picturesque mountain called Saddle Peak, 2,400 feet high, a landmark for all sailors. They skirted the coast, but they saw none of the inhabitants. The appearance of the islands was magnificent. Immense forests of palm, teak, and gigantic mimosas, tree ferns, covered the foreground of the landscape, while at the back rose the undulating profile of the hills. The cliffs swarmed with that species of swallows which build the edible nests so prized in China. But the islands were soon passed, and the Rangoon rapidly steamed towards the Straits of Malacca, which give access to the Chinese Sea. Now, what is Fix doing all this time? Having left instructions for the transmission of the warrant to Hong Kong, he had embarked on board the Rangoon without being perceived by Passepartout, and was in hopes to be able to keep out of sight until the steamer should have reached her destination. In fact, it would be difficult to explain his presence on board without awakening the suspicions of Passepartout, who thought him in Bombay. But fate obliged him to resume acquaintance with the lad, as we shall later see. All the aspirations and hopes of the detective were now centred in Hong Kong, for the steamer would not stop at Singapore long enough for him to do anything there. It was at Hong Kong that the arrest must be made, or the thief would escape forever. Hong Kong, in fact, was English territory, but the last British territory which they would see on the route. Beyond that, China, Japan, and America would offer an almost secure asylum to Mr. Fogg. If they should find the warrant of arrest at Hong Kong, Fix could hand Fogg over to the local police and have done with him. But after leaving the island, a simple warrant would not be sufficient. A warrant of extradition would be necessary, which would give rise to delays of all kinds, and of which the criminal might take advantage and escape. So, if he did not arrest him at Hong Kong, he might give up the idea altogether. Now, said Fix to himself, either the warrant will be at Hong Kong, and I shall arrest my man, or it will not be there, and this time I must delay his departure at any cost. But what means shall I adopt to stop him if the worst comes to the worst? Fix then, as a last resource, made up his mind to tell Passepartout everything, and what sort of a man his master was, for he was not his accomplice evidently. Passepartout would no doubt, under those circumstances, assist him, Fix. But in any case this was a dangerous expedient, and one not to be employed except under pressure. A hint from Passepartout to his master would upset the whole thing at once. The detective, therefore, was very much embarrassed, and the presence of Mrs. Alder on board gave him more food for thought. Who was this woman, and how did it happen that she was in Fogg's society? They must have met between Bombay and Calcutta, but at what place? Was it by chance, or had he purposely gone to seek this charming woman? For she was charming, no doubt. Fix had seen as much in the court at Calcutta. He was puzzled and began to think that perhaps there had been an elopement. He was certain of it. This idea now took complete possession of Fix, and he began to think what advantage he could gain from the circumstance. Whether the young lady was married or not, there was still the elopement, and he might make it so unpleasant for Mr. Fogg at Hong Kong that he would not be able to get away by paying money. But the Rangoon had to get to Hong Kong first, and could he wait? For Fogg had an unpleasant habit of jumping from one steamer to another, and might be far away before anything had been settled. The thing to do, therefore, was to give notice to the English authorities and to signal the Rangoon before she arrived. This was not difficult, as the steamer stopped at Singapore, and he could telegraph thence to Hong Kong. In any case, before taking decisive action, he determined to question Passepartout. He knew it was not difficult to make the lad talk, and Fix decided to make himself known. There was no time to lose, for the steamer would reach Singapore the following day. That afternoon, therefore, Fix left his cabin, and seeing Passepartout on deck, the detective rushed towards him, exclaiming, "What, you on board the Rangoon? Mr. Fix, is it really you?" said Passepartout, as he recognized his fellow voyager of the Mongolia. "Why, I left you at Bombay, and here you are on the way to Hong Kong. Are you also going round the world?" "No," replied Fix. "I think of stopping at Hong Kong for a few days, at any rate." "Ah," said Passepartout, "but how is it that I have not seen you on board since we left Calcutta?" "The fact is, I have not been very well, and obliged to stay below. The Bay of Bengal does not suit me as well as the Indian Ocean." "And how is your master, Mr. Phileas Fogg?" "Oh, quite well, and as punctual to his time as ever. But, Mr. Fix, you do not know that we have got a young lady with us." "A young lady?" repeated the detective, who pretended not to understand what was said. Passepartout nodded and immediately proceeded to give him the history of the business at the pagoda, the purchase of the elephant, the suttee, the rescue of Alder, the judgment of the Calcutta court, and their release on bail. Fix, who was quite familiar with the last incidents, pretended to be ignorant of all, and Passepartout was quite delighted to have such an interested listener. "But," said Fix, when his companion had ceased, "does your master wish to carry this young lady to Europe?" "By no means, Mr. Fix, by no means. We are simply going to Hong Kong to place her under the care of a relative of hers, a rich merchant there." "Nothing to be done on that line," said the detective to himself as he concealed his disappointment. "Come and have a glass of gin, monsieur." "With all my heart, Mr. Fix. The least we can do is to have a friendly glass to our meeting on board the Rangoon." Chapter 17. What happened at the voyage between Singapore and Hong Kong. After that, Passepartout and the detective met frequently, but the latter was very reserved and did not attempt to pump his companion respecting Mr. Fogg. He only encountered that gentleman once or twice, for he kept very much in the cabin, attending on Mrs. Alder, or engaged in a game of whist. As for Passepartout, he began to meditate very seriously upon the curious chance which had brought Mr. Fix once again on his master's track, and it certainly was somewhat astonishing. How was it that this amiable, good-natured gentleman, whom they had met first at Suez and on board the Mongolia, who had landed at Bombay, where he said he was going to remain, was now on board the Rangoon, bound for Hong Kong, and, in a word, following Mr. Fogg step by step? That was the question. It certainly was a most extraordinary coincidence, and what did Fix want? Passepartout was ready to wager his Indian shoes, which all this time he had carefully preserved, that this man Fix would leave Hong Kong with them, and probably on board the same steamer. If Passepartout had worried his head for 100 years, he never would have hit upon the real object of the detective. It would never have occurred to him that Phileas Fogg was being tracked round the globe for a robbery. But as it is only human nature to find some explanation for everything, this is how Passepartout interpreted Fix's unremitting attention, and after all it was not an unreasonable conclusion to arrive at. In fact, he made up his mind that Fix was an agent sent after Mr. Fogg by the members of the Reform Club to see that the conditions of the wager were properly carried out. "That's it," repeated Passepartout to himself, very proud of his shrewdness. "He is a spy these gentlemen have sent out. It is scarcely a gentlemanly thing to do. Mr. Fogg is so honourable and straightforward. Fancy sending a spy after us. Ah, gentlemen of the Reform Club, this shall cost you dearly." Passepartout, quite delighted with the discovery, determined to say nothing to his master on the subject, lest he should be very justly offended at his opponent's distrust, but he determined to chaff Fix at every opportunity without betraying himself. On Wednesday, the 30th of October, the Rangoon entered the Straits of Malacca, which separate that peninsula from Sumatra, and at 4 o'clock the next morning, the Rangoon, having gained half a day in advance of time, anchored at Singapore to coal. Phileas Fogg, having noted the gain in his book, went ashore accompanied by Mrs. Alder, who expressed a wish to land for a few hours. Fix, who was very suspicious of Fogg's movements, followed without being noticed, and Passepartout, who was secretly amused at the detective's manoeuvres, went about his usual business. The island of Singapore, though not grand or imposing, still has its peculiar beauties. It is a park traversed by pleasant roads. A well-appointed carriage took Phileas Fogg and Alder through palm groves and clove plantations. Various tropical plants perfumed the air, while troops of monkeys gambolled in the trees. The woods also were not innocent of tigers, and to those travellers who were astonished to learn why these terrible animals were not destroyed in such a small island, the reply would be that they swarm across from the mainland. After a couple of hours' drive, Mr. Fogg and Alder returned to the town and went on board ship again, all the time followed by the detective. Passepartout was awaiting them on deck. The brave fellow had purchased some beautiful mangoes and was enabled to offer them to Mrs. Alder, who received them gracefully. At 11 o'clock the Rangoon resumed her voyage, and a few hours later Malacca had sunk below the horizon. They had about 1,300 miles to traverse to reach Hong Kong, and Phileas Fogg hoped to get there in 6 days, so as to be able to catch the steamer for Yokohama on the 6th of November. The weather, which had hitherto been very fine, changed with the last quarter of the moon. There was a high wind, fortunately favourable, and a very heavy sea. The captain set the sails at every opportunity, and the Rangoon, under these circumstances, made rapid progress. But in very rough weather, extra precautions were necessary, and steam had to be reduced. This delay did not appear to affect Phileas Fogg in the least, but it worried Passepartout tremendously. He swore at the captain, the engineers, and the company, and consigned all concerned to a warmer climate than Hong Kong. Perhaps the thought of the gas that was still burning in his room in London may have had something to do with his impatience. "You seem in a great hurry to reach Hong Kong," said Fix to him one day. "I am," replied Passepartout. "You think Mr. Fogg is anxious to catch the steamer for Yokohama?" "Very anxious indeed. You believe in this journey round the world, then?" "Most decidedly. Don't you?" "Not a bit of it." "You are a sly one," replied Passepartout with a wink. This remark rather disturbed Fix, without his knowing why. Could the Frenchman have discovered who he was? He did not know what to do. But how could Passepartout have found out his real object? And yet, in speaking as he did, Passepartout must certainly have had some ulterior motive. On a subsequent occasion, the valet went still further and said, half maliciously, "Well, Mr. Fix, shall we be so unfortunate as to lose the pleasure of your society at Hong Kong?" "Well," replied Fix, somewhat embarrassed, "I am not quite sure. You see—" "Ah," said Passepartout, "if you would only come with us, I should be so delighted. An agent of the company cannot stop halfway, you know. You were only going to Bombay, and here you are almost in China. America is not far off, and from America to Europe is but a step." Fix looked very hard at his companion, whose face was perfectly innocent, and laughed too. But Passepartout was in the humour of quizzing, and asked him if he made much by his present business. "Yes and no," replied Fix, without flinching. "We have our good and bad times, but of course I do not travel at my own expense." "Of that I am quite sure," said Passepartout, laughing. Fix then returned to his cabin, where he remained deep in thought. Somehow or another, the French had found him out, but had he told his master? Was he his accomplice or not, and must the whole thing be given up? The detective passed many hours considering the matter in all its bearings, and was as undecided at the end as he had been at the beginning. But he retained his presence of mind, and resolved at length to deal frankly with Passepartout, if he could not arrest Fogg at Hong Kong. Either the servant was an accomplice, knowing everything, and he would fail, or the servant knew nothing, and then his interest would be to quit the service of the criminal. Such was the state of affairs, and meantime Phileas Fogg appeared perfectly indifferent to everything. But nevertheless there was a disturbing cause not far off, which might be able to produce an influence on his heart. But no, Mrs. Alder's charms had no effect, to the great surprise of Passepartout. Yes, it certainly was a matter of astonishment to that worthy man, who every day read the lady's gratitude to his master in Mrs. Alder's eyes. Phileas Fogg must certainly be heartless. Brave he was, no doubt, but sympathetic, no. There was no proof that the incident of the journey had wakened any feelings in his breast, while Passepartout was continually indulging in reverie. One day he was contemplating the working of the machinery, when a pitch of the vessel threw the screw out of the water. The steam roared through the valves, and Passepartout exclaimed indignantly, "The escape valves are not sufficiently charged. We make no way. That is English all over. Ah, if this were only an American ship, we might blow up, perhaps, but at any rate, we should go quicker meantime." Chapter 18, in which Phileas Fogg, Passepartout, and Fix severally go each about his own business. During the latter part of the voyage, the weather was very bad. The wind was blowing freshly, almost a gale, right in the teeth of the Rangoon, which rolled considerably and disturbed the passengers very much. In fact, on the 3rd and 4th of November, there was quite a tempest, and the Rangoon was obliged to proceed slowly. All the sails were furled, and the captain was of opinion that they would be 20 hours late at Hong Kong, or perhaps more, if the storm lasted. Phileas Fogg gazed at the turbulent sea as coolly as ever. He betrayed no impatience, even though 20 hours' delay would upset his calculations by causing him to lose the Yokohama steamer. It seemed almost as if the storm were part of his program, and Mrs. Alder, who sympathized with him, was surprised to find him quite unmoved. But Fix did not look upon these things with unconcern. He was very glad that the storm had happened, and would have been delighted if the Rangoon had been obliged to scud before the tempest. All these delays were in his favour because they tended towards detaining Mr. Fogg at Hong Kong. He did not mind the seasickness he suffered, and while his body was tortured, his spirit was exultant. But Passepartout was very much annoyed by this bad weather. All had gone well till now. Everything had appeared to favour his master hitherto. Steamers and railways obeyed him. Wind and steam had united to assist him. Was it possible that the hour of misfortune had struck? Passepartout felt as if the wager of £20,000 was to come out of his own purse. The storm exasperated him, the wind made him furious, and he would have liked to have whipped this disobedient sea. Poor fellow, Fix all the time carefully concealed his personal satisfaction, for had Passepartout perceived it, Fix would have had a bad time. Passepartout remained on deck as long as the storm lasted, for it was quite impossible for him to go down below. He assisted the crew in every way in his power, and astonished the sailors by his activity. He questioned the captain, the officers, and the men hundreds of times as to their progress, and got laughed at for his pains. He wanted to know how long the tempest would last, and was referred to the barometer, which had evidently not made up its mind to rise. Even when Passepartout shook it, it would not change its mind. At last, the storm subsided, and the wind veered round to the south, which was in their favour. Passepartout regained his serenity as the weather improved. Sails were once more set on the Rangoon, and she lost her route at great speed, but she could not make up for lost time. It could not be helped, however, and the land was not signalled till 5 o'clock on the morning of the 6th of November. The itinerary of Phileas Fogg showed that they ought to have arrived the day before, so they were 24 hours behindhand, and the Yokohama steamer would be missed. At 6 o'clock the pilot came on board. Passepartout longed to ask the man if the Yokohama steamer had sailed, but he preferred to nurse his hopes till the last moment. He had confided his troubles to Fix, who, sly fellow as he was, pretended to sympathize with him and told him he would be in time if his master took the next steamer, a remark which put Passepartout into a violent rage. But if he did not like to ask the pilot, Mr. Fogg, having consulted his Bradshaw, did not hesitate to inquire when the steamer left for Yokohama. "Tomorrow, at the morning's flood tide," replied the pilot. "Ah, indeed," said Mr. Fogg, without manifesting any emotion. Passepartout could have embraced the pilot for this information, while Fix would gladly have twisted his neck. "What is the name of the steamer?" asked Mr. Fogg. "The Carnatic," replied the pilot. "Ought she not to have sailed yesterday?" "Yes, but one of her boilers required repairing, so she will not start till tomorrow." "Thank you," replied Mr. Fogg, as he descended quietly to the cabin. Passepartout wrung the pilot's hand, exclaiming, "Well, you are a good fellow." Probably to this day, the pilot has not the slightest idea of what Passepartout was driving at. He merely whistled and went back to his station on the bridge to guide the steamer through a flotilla of junks, tankers and fishing boats, and a crowd of other vessels which encumbered the waters of Hong Kong. At 1 o'clock the steamer was alongside the quay and the passengers went ashore. On this occasion it must be confessed that fortune had singularly favoured Phileas Fogg, but for the necessary repairs of her boilers the Carnatic would have sailed on the 5th, and the travellers bound for Japan would have been obliged to wait for 8 days for the next steamer. Mr. Fogg, it is true, was 24 hours behindhand, but this would not seriously affect his journey. In fact, the steamer which piled from Yokohama to San Francisco was connected with the Hong Kong boat and would not start till the arrival of the latter, so if he were 24 hours late at Yokohama, he would make it up in crossing the Pacific. At present, however, Phileas Fogg found himself 24 hours late during the 35 days since he quitted London. The Carnatic would sail the next morning at 5 o'clock, so Mr. Fogg had still 16 hours to devote to Mrs. Alder. He landed with the young lady upon his arm and conducted her to the Clubhouse Hotel, where apartments were engaged for her accommodation. Mr. Fogg then went in search of her relatives, telling Passepartout to remain until his return, so that the young lady might not feel herself quite alone. Mr. Fogg made his way to the exchange, for he rightly conjectured that such a rich man as Jajib would be most likely heard of in that direction. The broker to whom Mr. Fogg addressed himself knew the man for whom he was inquiring, but he had left China 2 years before, and gone to live in Holland, he thought, for he had principally traded with Dutch merchants. Phileas Fogg returned to the hotel and informed Mrs. Alder that her cousin had left Hong Kong and had gone to live in Holland. Mrs. Alder made no reply for a moment. She passed her hand across her brow and appeared lost in thought. At length, in a gentle voice, she said, "What ought I to do, Mr. Fogg?" "Your course is simple enough," he replied. "Come on to Europe." "But I cannot intrude upon you." "You do not intrude in the least." "Passepartout?" "Sir, go to the Carnatic and secure 3 berths." Passepartout was delighted to think that the young lady was going to continue her journey with them, for she had been very kind to him. He accordingly quitted the hotel to execute his master's orders cheerfully. Chapter 19, showing how Passepartout took great interest in his master and what came of it. Hong Kong is only an island which fell into the possession of the English by the Treaty of Nankin in 1843. In a few years, the colonizing enterprise of the British made it an important city and a fine port, Victoria. The island is at the mouth of the Canton River, 60 miles only from Macau, upon the opposite bank. Hong Kong has beaten the other port in the struggle for commercial supremacy, and the greater traffic in Chinese merchandise finds its way to the island. There are docks, hospitals, wharfs, warehouses, a cathedral, a government house, macadamized roads, which give to Hong Kong as English an aspect as a town in Kent or Surrey, which had by some accident fallen to the antipodes. Passepartout, with his hands in his pockets, wandered towards Port Victoria, gazing at the people as they passed and admiring the palanquins and other conveyances. The city appeared to him like Bombay, Calcutta, and Singapore, or like any other town colonized by the English. At the port situated at the mouth of the Canton River was a regular confusion of ships of all nations, commercial and warlike, junks, sempas, tankas, and even flower boats, like floating garden borders. Passepartout remarked several of the natives, elderly men, clothed in nankeen, and when he went to a barber's to be shaved, he inquired of the man, who spoke pretty good English, who they were, and was informed that these men were all 80 years of age, and were therefore permitted to wear the imperial colour, namely yellow. Passepartout, without exactly knowing why, thought this very funny. After being shaved, he went to the quay from which the Carnatic was to start, and there he found Fix, walking up and down in a very disturbed manner. "Ho, ho," thought Passepartout, "this does not look well for the Reform Club," and with a merry smile he accosted the detective without appearing to have noticed his vexation. Fix had indeed good reasons for feeling annoyed. The warrant had not arrived. No doubt it was on its way, but it was quite impossible it could reach Hong Kong for several days, and as this was the last British territory at which Mr. Fogg would touch, he would escape if he could not be detained somehow. "Well, Mr. Fix," said Passepartout, "have you decided to come to America with us?" "Yes," replied Fix, between his clenched teeth. "Come along then," said Passepartout, laughing loudly. "I knew you could not leave us. Come and engage your berth." So they went to the office and took 4 places, but the clerk informed them that the Carnatic, having had her repairs completed, would sail that evening at 8 o'clock, and not next morning, as previously announced. "Very good," said Passepartout. "That will suit my master exactly. I will go and tell him." And now Fix determined to make a bold move. He would tell Passepartout everything. This was perhaps the only way by which he could keep Phileas Fogg at Hong Kong. As they quitted the office, Fix offered his companion some refreshment, which Passepartout accepted. They saw a tavern close by, which they entered, and reached a large, well-decorated room, at the end of which was a large camp bedstead furnished with cushions. On this lay a number of men asleep. About 30 people were seated at small tables drinking beer, porter, brandy, or other liquors, and the majority of drinkers were smoking long pipes of red clay filled with little balls of opium, steeped in rosewater. From time to time, a smoker would subside under the table, and the waiters would carry him and place him on the bed at the end of the room. There were about 20 of these stupefied smokers altogether. Fix and Passepartout perceived that they had entered a smoking house patronized by those wretched idiots devoted to one of the most injurious vices of humanity, the smoking of opium, which the English merchants sell every year to the value of £1,400,000. The Chinese government has vainly endeavoured by stringent laws to remedy the evil, but in vain. The habit has descended from the rich to the poorest classes, and now opium is smoked everywhere, at all times, by men and women, and those accustomed to it cannot do without it. A great smoker can consume 8 pipes a day, but he dies in 5 years. It was to one of these dens that Fix and Passepartout had come for refreshment. The latter had no money, but accepted his companion's treat, hoping to return the civility at some future time. Fix ordered 2 bottles of port, to which the Frenchman paid considerable attention, while Fix, more cautious, watched his companion narrowly. They talked upon many subjects, and particularly respecting Fix's happy determination to sail in the Carnatic, and that put Passepartout in mind that he ought to go and inform his master respecting the alteration in the time of the steamer's departure, which, as the bottles were empty, he proceeded to do. "Just one moment," said Fix, detaining him. "What do you want, Mr. Fix? I want to speak to you seriously." "Seriously?" exclaimed Passepartout. "Well then, let us talk tomorrow. I have no time today." "You had better wait," said Fix. "It concerns your master." Passepartout looked closely at his companion, and as the expression of his face was peculiar, he sat down again. "What have you got to say to me?" he said. Fix placed his hand on his companion's arm and said in a low voice, "You have guessed who I am, eh?" "Rather," replied Passepartout. "Well then, I am going to tell you everything. Yes, now that I know everything, my friend, that's pretty good. However, go on, but first let me tell you that those gentlemen have sent you on a wild goose chase. It is evident that you do not know how large the sum in question is," said Fix. "Oh yes, but I do," said Passepartout. "It is £20,000. "55,000, replied Fix, shaking the Frenchman's hand. "What?" exclaimed Passepartout. "Has Mr. Fogg risked £55,000? Well then, all the more reason we should not lose any time," he added as he rose from his chair. £55,000, continued Fix, pressing his companion into his seat again as a flask of brandy was placed before them, "and if I succeed, I shall get a percentage of £2,000. If you will assist me, I will give you 500. "Assist you?" exclaimed Passepartout, as he stared wildly at the detective. "Yes, assist me to keep Mr. Fogg here for some hours longer." "What is that you say?" said Passepartout. "Not content with tracking my master, do these gentlemen suspect his good face and wish to put obstacles in his way? I am ashamed of them." "What are you talking about?" said Fix. "I say it is a piece of meanness. They might just as well pick Mr. Fogg's pocket." "That is just the very thing we want to do." "Then it is a conspiracy, is it?" exclaimed Passepartout, who was getting excited by the brandy which he unconsciously had swallowed. "A regular conspiracy, and they call themselves gentlemen and friends." Fix began to feel very puzzled. "Friends!" exclaimed Passepartout. "Members of the Reform Club, indeed. Do you know, Mr. Fix, that my master is an honest man, and when he has made a bet, he wins it fairly?" "But you can guess who I am," said Fix, looking steadily at Passepartout. "An agent of the members of the club, whose business it is to hinder my master, and a dirty job it is too. So although I have found you out long ago, I did not like to betray you to Mr. Fogg." "Then he knows nothing about it?" said Fix quickly. "Nothing," replied Passepartout, emptying his glass once more. The detective passed his hand over his eyes and considered what he was to do. Passepartout appeared sincere, and this rendered his plan all the more difficult. He evidently was not his master's accomplice. "He will therefore help me," said Fix to himself. There was no time to lose. At any risk, Fogg must be stopped at Hong Kong. "Listen," said Fix in a sharp tone. "I am not what you think me." "Ah," said Passepartout. "I am a detective sent out by the police authorities in London." "You, a detective?" "Yes, I can prove it. Here is my authority." And drawing a paper from his pocket-book, he exhibited his instructions to the stupefied Passepartout, who was unable to utter a word. "This wager of Mr. Fogg's," continued Fix, "is merely to blindfold you and his colleagues at the Reform Club. He had a motive in securing your unconscious complicity." "But why?" said Passepartout. "For this reason. On the 28th of last September, the sum of £55,000 was stolen from the Bank of England by a person whose description is fortunately known. That description tallies exactly with Mr. Fogg's appearance." "Absurd!" exclaimed Passepartout, striking the table with his fist. "My master is the most honest man in the world." "What do you know about it?" replied Fix. "You only entered his service on the day he left on a mad excursion, without luggage, and carrying an immense sum of banknotes, and you dare to maintain that he is an honest man." "Yes, yes," repeated the other mechanically. "Do you wish to be arrested as an accomplice?" Passepartout clutched his head with both hands. He was stupefied. He did not dare to look at the detective. Phileas Fogg, a robber? This brave, generous man, the rescuer of Alda, a thief? And yet circumstantial evidence was strong. Passepartout did not wish to believe it. He could not believe in his master's guilt. "Well then, what do you want me to do?" he said, with an effort. "Look here," said Fix. "I have tracked Mr. Fogg so far, but as yet I have not received a warrant, and I asked to be sent it from London. You must help me to keep your master in Hong Kong. But if so, I will share with you the reward of £2,000 promised by the bank." "Never," replied Passepartout, who attempted to rise but fell back utterly exhausted and stupefied. "Mr. Fix," he stammered, "even if you have told the truth, supposing my master is a thief you are searching for, which I deny, I am still in his service. He is kind and generous to me, and I will never betray him for all the gold in the world." "You refuse, then?" "Absolutely." "Well then," said Fix, "forget all I have said, and now let us have a drink. Yes, let us have another glass." Passepartout felt that the liquor was overcoming him more and more. Fix, having made up his mind that he must be separated from his master at any price, determined to finish the matter. On the table were some pipes of opium. Fix handed one of these to Passepartout, who took a few puffs and fell back perfectly insensible. "At last," muttered Fix, as Passepartout collapsed. "Mr. Fogg will not hear of the change of time for the sailing of the Carnatic, and if so, he will have to go without this infernal Frenchman." Then, paying the score, he quitted the tavern. Chapter 20, showing how Fix and Fogg came face to face. While these events, which gravely compromised Mr. Fogg's future, were passing, that gentleman and Miss Alda were walking through the town. Since she had accepted Mr. Fogg's escort to England, she wished to make some purchases for the voyage, for a lady could not travel with a handbag as a gentleman might do. So she brought some necessary clothing, and Mr. Fogg overcame all her excuses with his characteristic generosity. "It is in my own interest," he invariably replied, "a part of my programme." Having purchased what they required, they returned to dinner at the hotel. Mrs. Alda subsequently retired to rest, leaving Mr. Fogg reading the Times and Illustrated News. Had Mr. Fogg been a man likely to be astonished at anything, he would have been surprised at the absence of his servant at bedtime. So, believing that the steamer did not start for Yokohama till the following morning, he did not trouble himself, but Passepartout did not appear when Mr. Fogg rang for him next morning, and then he learnt that his servant had not come in during the night. Without a word, Mr. Fogg packed his bag and sent to call Miss Alda for a palanquin, and reached the quay. Then, and not till then, they were informed that the Carnatic had left the previous evening. Mr. Fogg, who had made up his mind to find the steamer and the servants both awaiting him, was obliged to go without either. He showed no anxiety, merely remarking to Mrs. Alda, "An incident of travel, madame, nothing more." At this moment, a man who had been watching them approached. It was Fix. He approached Mr. Fogg and said, "Were you not one of the passengers on board the Rangoon yesterday, as well as myself?" "Yes, sir," replied Mr. Fogg coldly, "but I have not the honour. Excuse me, but I expected to find your servant here." "Do you know where he is?" asked the young lady quickly. "What?" exclaimed Fix, in feigned surprise. "Is he not with you?" "No," replied Mrs. Alda. "He has been absent since yesterday." "Perhaps he has sailed in the Carnatic." "Without you, madame?" said the detective. "You will excuse my question, but you counted on leaving in that steamer?" "Yes, sir." So did I, madame, and I am terribly disappointed. The fact is, the Carnatic was ready for sea 12 hours sooner than was expected, and now we shall have to wait 12 days for another steamer." Fix was delighted as he said this. In 8 days, the warrant would arrive. His chances were good, but his disgust may be guessed when he heard Fogg say, in his usual calm tone, "I suppose there are other ships beside the Carnatic in Hong Kong harbour," and offering his arm to Mrs. Alder, he turned away towards the docks. Fix followed him in a dogged sort of manner. He appeared to be attached to Fogg by some invisible cord, but fortune had evidently abandoned Phileas Fogg. For 3 mortal hours he wandered about the docks, endeavouring to charter a vessel to take him to Yokohama, but all the ships were either loading or unloading and could not go. The detective's spirits rose again. But Mr. Fogg was not discouraged. He made up his mind to continue his search, even if he had to cross to Macau. At length he was accosted by a sailor. "Is your Honour looking for a boat?" "Have you a boat ready to sail?" asked Mr. Fogg. "I have. A pilot boat, number 43, the best in the harbour." "Can she sail fast?" "She can make 8 or 9 knots an hour or more." "Would you like to see her?" "Yes." "You will be pleased, I'm sure." "Is it for a trip that you require her?" "Somewhat more than that. For a voyage." "A voyage?" "I want you to take me to Yokohama." The sailor folded his arms and looked steadily at Mr. Fogg. "Is your Honour serious?" he said. "Yes. I have lost the Carnatic, and I must be at Yokohama on the 14th at latest to catch the steamer for San Francisco." "I am very sorry," replied the pilot, "but it is impossible. I will give you £100 a day and a bonus of £200 if you arrive in time." "Are you in earnest?" asked the pilot. "Very much so," replied Mr. Fogg. The pilot took a turn up and down the wharf. He looked out to sea, and was evidently struggling between his wish to get the money and his fear of venturing so far. Fix, all this time, was on tenterhooks. Mr. Fogg turned to Mrs. Alder and asked her if she were afraid. "Not with you, Mr. Fogg," replied the young lady. Just then the pilot returned, twirling his hat in his hands. "Well, pilot?" said Mr. Fogg. "Well, your Honour," replied the pilot. "I cannot risk my life or my men, or even you, in such a voyage, in so small a ship, at this time of year. Besides, we could not get to Yokohama in time. It is 1,650 miles away." "Only 1,600? said Mr. Fogg. "Oh, it is all the same." Fix breathed again. "But," continued the pilot, "we might manage it in another way." Fix scarcely dared to breathe. "How do you mean?" asked Fogg. "By going to Nagasaki, which is only 1,100 miles, or to Shanghai, which is 800. In the latter case, we shall be able to keep close inshore, and have advantage of the current." "But," replied Fogg, "I shall take the American mail steamer at Yokohama, and not at Shanghai or Nagasaki." "Well, why not?" replied the pilot. "The San Francisco does not start from Yokohama, it starts from Shanghai, and only calls at Yokohama and Nagasaki." "Are you quite sure of that?" "Certain." "And when does she leave Shanghai?" "On the 11th, at 7 o'clock in the evening. So we have 4 days, which are 96 hours, and at the rate of 8 knots an hour, if the wind hold, we shall be able to reach Shanghai in time." "And when will you be able to start?" "In an hour. I only want to buy some provisions and bend the sails." "Well, it is a bargain. Are you the owner?" "Yes, my name is John Bunsby, owner of the Tankadere. Would you like something on account, if convenient to your Honour?" "Here are £200, sir," continued Fogg, turning to Fix. if you would like to take advantage of this opportunity." "Thank you, sir," replied Fix. "I was about to beg the favour of you." "Well then, we shall be ready in half an hour." "But what shall we do about the servant?" said Mrs. Alder, who was much distressed at Passepartout's absence. "I will do all I can for him," replied Fogg, and while they directed their steps towards the police office, Fix went on board the pilot's boat. Phileas left the description of his servant with the police and a sum of money to be spent in seeking him. The same formality was gone through at the French consulate, and then, procuring their luggage which had been sent back to the hotel, they went down to the wharf. 3 o'clock struck. The pilot's boat, number 43, was ready to start. She was a pretty little schooner, about 20 tons, built for speed, like a racing yacht. She was as bright and clean as possible, and Bunsby evidently took a pride in his little craft. Her masts raked rather interestingly. She carried foresail and the usual sails for a ship of her tonnage. She could evidently make good way, as indeed she had proved by winning several prizes. The crew consisted of the owner and 4 other men, all well acquainted with the neighbouring seas, which they scoured in search of ships wanting pilots. John Bunsby was a man of about 45, vigorous and full of decision and energy, calculated to reassure the most nervous passengers. Phileas Fogg and Mrs. Alder went on board, where they found Fix already installed. The accommodation was not extensive, but everything was clean and neat. "I am sorry I have nothing better to offer you," said Mr. Fogg to Fix. The latter bowed without replying, for he felt somewhat humiliated in accepting Fogg's kindness under the circumstances. At any rate, he thought, if he is a rascal, he is a very polite one. At 10 minutes past 3, the sails were hoisted, the English flag was run up to the peak, the passengers took a last look at the quays in the hope of descrying Passepartout, but they were disappointed. Fix was somewhat afraid that some chance might bring the lad whom he had treated so badly in that direction, and then an explanation would surely have ensued of a nature by no means satisfactory to the detective. But the Frenchman did not turn up, and no doubt he was still under the influence of the opium. So John Bunsby stood out to sea, and the Tankadere, with the wind on the quarter, went bounding briskly over the waves. Chapter 21, showing how the owner of the Tankadere nearly lost the bonus of the £200. This voyage of 800 miles was one of great risk at that season of the year in those seas, which are usually very rough, particularly during the equinoxes, and it was then the beginning of November. It would have been very much to the advantage of the owner of the Tankadere to have gone on to Yokohama, as he was paid so much a day, but such a voyage would have been extremely rash. It was a risk to go to Shanghai still. John Bunsby had confidence in his ship, which sailed like a bird, and perhaps he was right. "There is no need for me to urge you to speed," said Fogg to Bunsby, when they had got out to sea. "Your honour may depend upon me," replied Bunsby. "I will do all I can." "Well, it is your business and not mine, pilot, and I trust you thoroughly." Phileas Fogg, standing upright with his legs stretched apart, was as steady as a sailor as he gazed over the foaming sea. Mrs. Alder, seated aft, was somewhat nervous as she contemplated the ocean. The sails bellied out overhead like great wings, and the schooner ran before the wind at great pace. Night fell. The moon was only in the first quarter, and her light would soon be quenched beneath the horizon. Clouds were rising in the east, and already banking up. The pilot hung out the vessel's lights, an indispensable proceeding, for collisions were by no means unfrequent, and any such occurrence, at the speeds they were now going, would shatter the gallant little craft to pieces. Fix, seated up in the bows, held himself aloof as he knew Fogg was not so much of a talker. Besides, he did not quite like to enter into conversation with this man whose good offices he had accepted. He thought of the future, for it now seemed certain that Fogg would not stop at Yokohama, but would immediately take the steamer for San Francisco so as to reach America, where he would be safe. Fogg's plan seemed to the detective to be very simple. Instead of embarking in England for the United States, like a common swindler, Fogg had made a tour 3 parts round the globe, so as to gain the American continent more safely, and once there, he could enjoy himself comfortably with his spoil. But what could Fix do in the United States? Should he give up the man? No, certainly not, and until he had obtained an act of extradition, he would not lose sight of him. This was his duty, and he would carry it out to the bitter end. There was one thing, at any rate, to be thankful for. Passepartout was not now with his master, and after Fix's confidence imparted to him, it was very important that the servant should not see his master again in a hurry. Phileas Fogg was himself thinking about his servant, who had so curiously disappeared. But after consideration of the circumstances, it did not appear improbable that the young man had gone on board the Carnatic at the last moment. This was also Mrs. Alder's opinion, for she deeply regretted the worthy fellow's absence, as she was so deeply indebted to him. They might, therefore, find him at Yokohama, and if he were on the Carnatic, it would be easy to ascertain the fact. About 10 o'clock the breeze began to freshen, and though it might have been prudent to take in a reef or two, the pilot, after taking an observation, let the sails stand, for the Tankadere carried her canvas well, but everything was prepared to furl the sails in case of necessity. At midnight, Phileas Fogg and Mrs. Alder went below. Fix had already turned in, but the owner and his crew remained on deck all night. By sunrise next morning, the schooner had made 100 miles. The log showed they were going about 80 or 9 knots an hour. They were still carrying on, and if the wind held, the chances were in their favour. The vessel made her way along the coast all that day. The sea was not so rough, as the wind blew offshore, which was a very fortunate circumstance for such a small vessel. About noon, the breeze fell a little and shifted to the southeast. The owner spread his topsails and furled them again as the breeze showed signs of freshening once more. Mr. Fogg and Mrs. Alder did not suffer from seasickness and ate with a good appetite, and Fix, invited to partake of the meal, was obliged to accept very unwillingly. He did not like to travel and eat at the expense of the man he was tracking, but yet he was obliged to eat, and so he ate. After dinner he found an opportunity to speak to Mr. Fogg privately. "Sir," he said. This term scorched his lips, so to speak, and he had to control himself. His impulse was to arrest this gentleman. "Sir," said he, "it is very good of you to give me a passage, but although I cannot spend money as freely as you do, I shall be happy to pay my expenses." "You need not say anything about that," replied Mr. Fogg. "But if I insist upon it?" "No, sir," replied Fogg, in a tone which admitted of no discussion. "This is included in my general expenses." Fix bowed. He felt half stifled, and going forward, he sat down and did not speak for the whole day. Meantime, they were making good progress. John Bunsby was in hopes of succeeding, and frequently said to Mr. Fogg that they would be in time, to which Fogg merely replied that he counted upon it. The crew, also inspired by the hope of reward, worked hard. Not a sheet required bracing, not a sail that was not well hoisted, not one unnecessary lurch could be attributed to the steersman. They could not have worked the schooner better if they had been sailing a match in the Royal Yacht Club regatta. By the evening, the log showed that they had run 220 miles, and Mr. Fogg hoped that when he arrived at Yokohama, he would not have to record any delay in his journal. If so, the only check he had met with since he left London would not affect his journey. Towards morning, the Tankadere entered the Straits of Fukien, which separate Formosa from the Chinese coasts. The sea was very rough, and it was difficult to stand on deck. At daybreak, the wind freshened still more, and there was every appearance of a storm. The mercury rose and fell at intervals. In the southeast, the sea rose in a long swell which betokened a tempest. The pilot studied the aspect of the heavens for a long time, and at last said to Mr. Fogg, "I suppose I may tell your honour what I think?" "Of course," replied Fogg. "Well, we are going to have a storm." "From the north or south?" asked Mr. Fogg calmly. "From the south. A typhoon is approaching." "I am glad this is coming from the south. It will help us on." "Oh, if you look on it in that light," said Bunsby, "I have no more to say." The presentiments of Bunsby were fulfilled. During the summer, the typhoon would have been probably dissipated in an electric cascade, but in the winter it would probably have its course. So the pilot took his precautions. He took in his sails and set merely the storm jib, and waited. The pilot begged his passengers to go below, but in such a narrow and confined space, the imprisonment was far from agreeable, so none of them would quit the deck. About 8 o'clock, the hurricane, with torrents of rain, burst upon them. With nothing but the small jib, the Tankadere was almost lifted out of the water by the tempest. She darted through the sea like a locomotive at full speed. All that day, the vessel was hurried towards the north, borne on the top of the monstrous waves. Time after time she was almost engulfed, but the careful steering of the pilot saved her. The passengers were drenched with spray, but took it philosophically. Fix grumbled, no doubt, but the brave Alda regarded her companion and admired his coolness, while she endeavoured to imitate it. As for Phileas Fogg, he took it as a matter of course. Hitherto the Tankadere had been sailing northwards, but towards evening, as the pilot had feared, the wind veered round to the northwest. The schooner plunged terribly in the trough of the sea, and it was fortunate she was so solidly built. The tempest increased, if possible, at night, and John Bunsby began to feel anxious. He consulted his crew as to what they should do. He then came to Mr. Fogg and said, "I think we should make for one of the ports hereabouts." "So do I," replied Fogg. "Yes," said the pilot, "but which?" "I only know of one," said Fogg quietly, "and that is Shanghai." This reply took the pilot aback rather at first, but recognizing Mr. Fogg's firmness, he said, "Yes, your honour is right. Shanghai be it." So they kept their course. The night was fearful. It seemed a miracle that the little vessel did not founder. Twice she was caught in the trough of the sea and would have gone down, but that everything was let fly. Mrs. Alder was knocked about, and more than once Mr. Fogg rushed to her assistance, though she made no complaint. At daybreak the storm was still raging, but suddenly the wind backed to the southeast. This was a change for the better, and the Tankadere again proceeded on her course, though the cross sea gave her some tremendous blows, sufficient to have crushed a less solid craft. The coast was occasionally visible through the mist, but not a sail was in sight. At noon, the weather cleared a little, the gale had blown itself out, and the travellers were enabled to take some rest. The night was comparatively quiet, and the pilot was induced to set a little more sail, and at daybreak Next morning, John Bunsby was able to declare that they were less than 100 miles from Shanghai. 100 miles and only 1 day to accomplish the distance. On that evening, they ought to be at Shanghai if they wished to catch the steamer for Yokohama, but for the storm, which had delayed them several hours, they would have been within 30 miles of their destination. The breeze continued to fall and the sea went down. All canvas was spread, and at 12 o'clock the Tankadier was only 45 miles from Shanghai. 6 hours still remained, and all were afraid they could not do it. Everyone on board, except Phileas Fogg, no doubt, felt the keenest anxiety. They must maintain a speed of 9 knots an hour, and the wind was falling rapidly and coming in puffs. Nevertheless, the schooner was so light and carried such a spread of canvas, besides being aided by the shore currents, that at 6 o'clock Bunsby reckoned they were only 10 miles from the Shanghai River. The town itself was situated about 12 miles higher up. At 7 o'clock they were still 3 miles from Shanghai. The pilot swore a formidable oath as he perceived the bonus of £200 slipping away from him. He looked at Mr. Fogg. Mr. Fogg was impassible, although his whole fortune was in the balance. At this moment a long black funnel, from which a thick train of smoke was issuing, appeared. This was the American steamer, leaving Shanghai at the proper time. "Confound it!" cried Bunsby, as he kept the schooner away a point. "Signal her," said Fogg quietly. There was a small brass cannon on the forecastle, which was used during fogs. This piece was charged to the muzzle, but just as the pilot was going to fire, Phileas said, "Hoist your flag." The ensign was run up half-mast. This was a signal of distress, and they hoped that the steamer would see it and heave to assist them. "Fire!" exclaimed Mr. Fogg, and the report of the little cannon immediately boomed over the sea. Chapter 22, showing how Passepartout finds out that even in the antipodes it is prudent to have money in his pocket. The Carnatic, bound for Japan, left Hong Kong on the 7th of November. 2 cabins were unoccupied. They had been engaged by Mr. Phileas Fogg. The following morning, the sailors were astonished to perceive a dishevelled, half-stupefied figure emerge from the fore-cabin and sit down on deck. This passenger was Passepartout, and this is what had happened. Soon after Fix had left the Opium Tavern, 2 waiters had laid Passepartout upon the couch reserved for smokers. 3 hours later, Passepartout, haunted by one idea, woke up and struggled against the stupefying influence of the drug. The thought of his unfulfilled duties assisted him to shake off his torpor. He left the den of drunkenness and, guiding himself by the walls, he staggered on, crying out, as in a dream, "The Carnatic! The Carnatic!" The steamer was alongside the wharf, ready to start. Passepartout had but a few paces to traverse. He rushed across the gangway and fell senseless on the deck just as the paddles began to revolve. The sailors, accustomed to this sort of thing, took him down to the fore-cabin, and when he awoke he was 50 miles from Hong Kong. This is how he found himself to be on board the Carnatic, inhaling the sea air, which sobered him by degrees. He began to collect his thoughts, which was no easy matter, but at length he was able to recall the occurrences of the day before. Fix's confidence and the opium smoking, etc. The fact is, he thought, I have been very tipsy. What will Mr. Fogg say? At any rate, I have not missed the steamer, and that is the principal thing. Then he thought of Fix. As for him, he muttered, I trust he has not dared to follow us on board this ship, as he said. A detective tracking my master and accusing him of robbing the Bank of England? Bosh! He is no more a robber than I am an assassin. Now, was he to tell all this to his master? Would it not be better to wait till they all reached London, and when the detective had followed them all round the world, to have a good laugh at him? This was a point to be considered. The first thing was to find Mr. Fogg and ask his pardon. Passepartout accordingly got up. The sea was rough and the ship rolled considerably. It was with some difficulty he reached the quarterdeck, but could not see anyone at all like his master or Mrs. Alder. All right, he thought, the lady is not up yet, and Mr. Fogg is probably playing whist as usual. Passepartout accordingly went down to the saloon. Mr. Fogg was not there. All he could do now was to ask the purser for his master's cabin. That individual replied that he knew no passenger by the name of Fogg. "Excuse me," said Passepartout. "He is a tall, cool, quiet-looking gentleman and is accompanied by a young lady." "There is no young lady on board," said the purser. "However, here is the passenger list and you can see for yourself." Passepartout did so. His master's name was not entered. Suddenly an idea occurred to him and he said, "Am I on the Carnatic?" "Yes," replied the purser. "On the way to Hong Kong?" "Yes, decidedly." Passepartout for the moment was afraid he had got on the wrong ship, but if he was on the Carnatic, it was evident that his master was not. Passepartout fell back on his chair. He was thunderstruck. All at once the light broke in upon his mind. He remembered that the hour of the ship sailing had been altered, that he ought to have told his master, and he had not done so. It was therefore his fault that they had missed the vessel. His fault, no doubt, but still more the fault of that traitor who had endeavoured to keep his master at Hong Kong and had made him, Passepartout, tipsy. He saw it all now. His master was ruined, arrested, and imprisoned perhaps. Passepartout was furious. Ah, if Fix ever came within his reach, what a settling of accounts there would be. Passepartout by degrees recovered his composure and began to look things in the face. He was on his route to Japan, at any rate, but he had no money in his pocket, and this was not a pleasant reflection. He literally did not possess a penny. Fortunately, his passage had been paid, so he had 5 or 6 days to make up his mind. He ate accordingly for the whole party, and as if there was nothing to be got to eat when he reached Japan. The Carnatic entered the harbour of Yokohama on the morning tide of the 13th and came alongside the quay near the custom house amidst a crowd of ships of every nationality. Passepartout went on shore to this curious land without any enthusiasm. He had nothing to do but to wander aimlessly through the streets. He first found himself in a thoroughly European quarter of the town, with houses ornamented with verandas and elegant peristyles. This portion of the town occupied all the space between the promontory of the treaty and the river, and included docks and warehouses, with many streets and squares. Here, as at Hong Kong and Calcutta, were a crowd of Americans, English, Chinese, and Dutch merchants ready to buy or sell almost anything, and Passepartout felt as strange amongst them as a Hottentot might have done. He had one resource at any rate. He could apply to the French or English consuls, but he shrank from telling his adventures, which were so intimately connected with his master. So before doing so, he thought he would try every other chance for a livelihood. After traversing the European quarter, he entered the Japanese district and made up his mind to push on to Yedo if necessary. The native quarter of Yokohama is called Benta, after the sea goddess worshipped on the neighbouring islands. Here he noticed beautiful groves of fir and cedar, sacred gates of peculiar construction, bridges enclosed by bamboos and reeds, and temples surrounded by immense and melancholy-looking cedars, wherein Buddhist priests and votaries of Confucius resided. There were long streets with crowds of infants who looked as if they were cut out of Japanese screens, and who were playing with bandy-legged poodles and with yellow cats without tails of a very lazy and very affectionate disposition. The streets were crowded with people passing and repassing, priests, policemen, custom house officers and soldiers, the Mikado's guard, in silken doublets and coats of mail, as well as other soldiers of all descriptions, for in Japan, the army is as much regarded as it is despised in China. There were friars, pilgrims with long robes and civilians with long black hair, large heads, long waists, thin legs and short of stature, with complexion some copper colour, some pale, but never yellow like the Chinese, from whom the Japanese differ essentially. Amongst the carriages, the palanquins, the barrows with sails, bamboo litters, he noticed many very pretty women moving about with tiny steps on tiny feet and shod with canvas shoes, with straw sandals and wooden clogs. They appeared to have small eyes, black teeth according to fashion, but wearing gracefully the national robe called kirimon, a sort of dressing gown crossed with a silk scarf and tied behind in a large knot, a mode which Parisian ladies have borrowed from the Japanese. Passepartout wandered about in the crowd for some hours, looking at the shops, at the glittering jewellers' establishments, the restaurants which he could not enter, the tea-houses where they drank sake, a liquor made from the fermentation of rice, and comfortable-looking tobacco shops where they smoked, not opium, which is almost unknown in Japan, but a fine tobacco. Thence he went on into the field. Amongst the rice plantations there were flowers of all sorts, giving forth their last perfumes, beautiful camellias, not on bushes but on trees, and bamboo enclosures with cherry, plum, and apple trees, which the natives cultivate rather for their blossom than their fruit. On almost every cedar tree an eagle was perched, and on the willows were melancholy herons standing on one leg, and crows, ducks, hawks, wild geese, and a quantity of cranes, which are looked upon as sacred by the Japanese, as conferring upon them long life and happiness. As he wandered on, Passepartout noted some violets amid the grass. "Good," he said, "here is my supper," but he found they were scentless. No chance there, he thought. Certainly, as a precaution, he had taken care to have a good meal before he left the Carnatic, but after walking a whole day, he felt somewhat hungry. He had already remarked that the butchers' shops displayed neither mutton, pork, nor kids, as he knew that it was forbidden to kill oxen, which are reserved for farming. He concluded that meat was scarce in Japan. He was not mistaken, but he could have put up with wild boar even, partridges, quails, fish or fowl, which the Japanese eat almost exclusively with rice. However, he kept up his spirits and looked forward to a meal next day. Night fell, and Passepartout re-entered the native quarter, where he wandered through the streets in the midst of coloured lanterns, looking on at the conjurers and at the astrologers who had collected a crowd round their telescopes. Then he wandered back to the harbour, lighted up by the fishermen's torches. At length the streets began to get empty, and to the crowd succeeded the patrols. These officers, in their splendid uniforms and followed by their attendants, looked like ambassadors, and every time Passepartout met one of these parties, he said to himself, "Good, good, another Japanese embassy, going to Europe. Chapter 23, in which Passepartout's nose gets immeasurably long. Next morning, Passepartout, very tired and very hungry, began to think that he was ought to eat something, and the sooner the better. He still had his watch, which he could sell, but he would rather die of hunger than do that. So now or never, he must make use of his powerful, if not melodious voice, with which nature had endowed him. He knew several French and English songs, and resolved to make the attempt. The Japanese were no doubt fond of music, since they were always beating cymbals, tom-toms, and drums, and they would no doubt appreciate European talent. But perhaps it was somewhat early to start a concert, and the dilettanti, awakened inopportunely, would not perhaps pay him in current coin of the realm. So Passepartout decided to wait, and meantime it occurred to him that he might as well change his clothes for some more in keeping with his present position, and afterwards he might be able to purchase something to eat. He immediately set about to carry out the idea, and after a long search he discovered a dealer in old clothes, with whom he made an exchange, and left the shop dressed in a Japanese robe and discoloured turban, but he had some money in his pocket also. All right, he thought, I must only fancy myself at a carnival. Passepartout's first care was to enter a quiet-looking tea-house, and then, with a portion of fowl and some rice, he breakfasted like a man who had not yet solved the problem as to where dinner was to come from. Now, he thought, after a hearty meal, I must consider what I am about. All I can do now is to sell this dress for another, still more Japanesey. I must think of some means of quitting this country for the sun as quickly as possible, and I shall not have a very pleasant recollection of it. He accordingly went to look at the steamers about to sail to America, for he intended to offer himself as a cook or steward in exchange for his passage of food. Once at San Francisco, he would manage to get on. The important thing was to cross the ocean. He was not the man to think about a thing very long, so he went at once to the docks, but his project, which had appeared so simple an idea, was not so easy to execute. What need was there for a cook or steward on board an American mailboat? And how could they trust him in his present costume? What reference or recommendation could he offer? As he was turning these questions over in his mind, his gaze fell upon a placard, which a circus clown was carrying through the streets. The notice was in English and read as follows: The Honourable William Batulcar's troupe of Japanese acrobats, positively the last representations prior to their departure for America, of the long noses, under the special patronage of the god Tingo. Great attraction. The United States of America, exclaimed Passepartout. That suits me all round. He followed the sandwich man and was soon in the Japanese quarter once again. In about a quarter of an hour they stopped before a large hut adorned with flags, upon which a troop of jugglers were depicted, without any attempt at perspective. This was the establishment of the Honourable Mr. Batulcar, a sort of Barnum, a director of a troupe of acrobats and jugglers who were given their last representations prior to their departure to the United States. Passepartout entered and asked for the proprietor. Mr. Batulcar appeared in person. What do you want? He said to Passepartout, whom he took for a native. Do you need a servant, sir? Asked Passepartout. A servant? Echoed the Barnum as he stroked his beard. I have two, obedient and faithful, who have never left me and served me for nothing but nourishment. And here they are, he added, as he extended his brawny arms, on which the great veins stood out like whipcord. So I can be of no use to you, then? Not the least. The devil! It would have been very convenient if I could have sailed with you. Ah, yes, said the Honourable Batulcar. You are just about as much a Japanese as I am a baboon, I guess. What are you dressed up like that for? One is obliged to dress as one can. That's a fact. You are a Frenchman, ain't you? Yes, a Parisian. Then I suppose you know how to make grimaces? Well, replied Passepartout, somewhat vexed that his nationality should provoke such a question. It is true that we Frenchmen do know how to make grimaces, but no better than Americans. That's so. Well, if I cannot take you as a servant, I can engage you as a clown. You see, my lad, this is how it is. In France they exhibit foreign clowns, and in foreign countries, French clowns. I see. You are pretty strong, I suppose? More particularly when I get up after dinner. And you know how to sing? Yes, replied Passepartout, who at one time had sung in the street concerts. But can you sing standing on your head with the top spinning on the sole of your left foot, and a sword balanced on your right foot? Something of that sort, replied Passepartout, who recalled the acrobatic performances of his youth. Well, that is the whole business, replied the Honourable Batulcar, and the engagement was ratified there and then. At length Passepartout had found something to do. He was engaged to make one of a celebrated Japanese troupe. This was not a high position, but in 8 days he would be on his way to San Francisco. The performance was advertised to commence at 3 o'clock, and although Passepartout had not rehearsed the business, he was obliged to form one of the human pyramid composed of the long noses of the god Tingu. This was the great attraction and was to close the performance. The house was crowded before 3 o'clock by peoples of all races, ages and sexes. The musicians took up their positions and performed vigorously on their noisy instruments. The performance was very much the same as all acrobatic displays, but it must be stated that the Japanese are the cleverest acrobats in the world. One of them, with a fan and a few bits of paper, did the butterfly and flower trick. Another traced in the air with the smoke of his pipe, a compliment to the audience. Another juggled with some lighted candles, which he extinguished successively as they passed his mouth, and which he relit one after the other, without for a moment ceasing his sleight-of-hand performances. Another produced a series of spinning tops which, in his hands, played all kinds of pranks as they whirled round. They ran along the stems of pipes, on the edges of swords, upon wires, and even on hairs stretched across the stage. They spun round crystal goblets, crossed bamboo ladders, ran into all the corners of the stage, and made strange music, combining various tones as they revolved. The jugglers threw them up in the air, knocked them from one to the other like shuttlecocks, put them into their pockets and took them out again, and all the time they never ceased to spin. But, after all, the principal attraction was the performance of the long noses, which has never been seen in Europe. These long noses were the select company under the immediate patronage of the god Tingao. Dressed in a costume of the Middle Ages, each individual wore a pair of wings, but they were specially distinguished by the inordinate length of their noses and the uses they made of them. These noses were simply bamboos from 5 to 10 feet long, some straight, some curved, some ribbed, and some with warts painted on them. On these noses, which were firmly fixed on their natural ones, they performed their acrobatic feats. A dozen of these artists lay upon their backs, while their comrades, dressed to represent lightning conductors, leaped from one to the other of their friends' noses, performing the most skillful somersaults. The whole was to conclude with the pyramid as had been announced, in which 50 long noses were to represent the car of Juggernaut. But instead of forming the pyramid on each other's shoulders, these artists mounted on each other's noses. Now, one of them, who used to act as the base of the car, had left the troop, and as only strength and adroitness were necessary for their position, Passepartout had been selected to fill it on this occasion. That worthy fellow felt very melancholy when he had donned his costume, adorned with parti-coloured wings, and had fixed his 6-foot nose to his face, but at any rate the nose would procure him something to eat, and he made up his mind to do what he had to do. He went on the stage and joined his colleagues. They all lay down on their backs, and then another party placed themselves on the long noses of the first. Another tier of performers climbed up on them, and then a third and a fourth, and upon the noses a human monument was raised almost to the flies. Then the applause rose loud and long. The orchestra played a deafening tune, when suddenly the pyramid shook. One of the noses at the base fell out, and the whole pyramid collapsed like a house of cards. It was all owing to Passepartout. Clearing himself from the scramble and leaping over the footlights without the aid of his wings, he scaled the gallery and fell at the feet of one of the spectators, crying out as he did so, "Oh, my master! My master! You! Yes, it is I! Well then, under those circumstances you had better go on board the steamer." So Mr. Fogg, Alder, who accompanied him, and Passepartout hastened out of the theatre. At the door they met the Honourable Mr. Batoucar, who was furious, and demanded damages for the breaking of the pyramid. Mr. Fogg quickly appeased him by handing him a roll of notes. At 6:30, the appointed hour for the sailing of the vessel, Mr. Fogg, Mrs. Alder, and Passepartout, who still wore his wings and long nose, stepped upon the deck of the American mail steamer. Chapter 24, in which the Pacific Ocean is crossed. The reader will easily guess what happened at Shanghai. The signals made by the Tankadere were perceived by the mail steamer, and soon afterwards, Phileas Fogg, having paid the price agreed upon, as well as a bonus of £550, he and his party were soon on board the steamer. They reached Yokohama on the 14th, and Phileas Fogg, leaving Fix to his own devices, went on board the Carnatic, where he heard, to Alder's great delight, and probably to his own, though he did not betray it, that a Frenchman named Passepartout had arrived in her the day before. Mr. Fogg, who was obliged to leave for San Francisco that very evening, immediately set out searching for his servant. To no purpose was it that he inquired at the consulate or walked about the streets, and he gave up the search. Was it by chance or presentiment that he visited Mr. Batoucar's entertainment? He would not certainly have recognized his servant in his eccentric dress, but Passepartout had spied his master out. He could not restrain a movement of the nose, and so the collapse had occurred. All this Passepartout learnt from Mrs. Alder, who also told him how they had come from Hong Kong with a certain Mr. Fix. Passepartout did not even wink at the name of Fix, for he thought the moment had not yet come to tell his master what had passed. So, in his recital of his own adventures, he merely said that he had been overtaken by opium. Mr. Fogg listened coldly to his excuses and then lent him money sufficient to obtain proper clothes. In about an hour he had got rid of his nose and wings and was once more himself again. The steamer in which they were crossing was called the General Grant and belonged to the Pacific Mail Company. She was a paddle steamer of 2,500 tons, had 3 masts, and at 12 knots an hour would not take more than 21 days to cross the ocean. So Phileas Fogg was justified in thinking that he would reach San Francisco on the 2nd of December, New York on the 11th, and London on the 20th, so gaining several hours on the fatal 21st. Nothing of any consequence occurred on the voyage. The Pacific fully bore out its name, and was as calm as Mr. Fogg himself. Mrs. Alder felt more and more attached to this taciturn man by even stronger ties than gratitude. She was more deeply impressed than she was aware of, and almost unconsciously gave herself up to emotion which, however, did not appear to have any effect upon Mr. Fogg. Besides, she took the greatest interest in his projects. Anything that threatened to interfere with his plans disquieted her extremely. She frequently consulted with Passepartout, and he, guessing how deeply she was interested, praised his master all day long. He calmed her apprehensions, insisted that the most difficult part of the journey had been accomplished and that they would soon be in civilized countries, and the railway to New York and the transatlantic steamer to Liverpool would bring them home within their time. 9 days after leaving Yokohama, Mr. Fogg had traversed just exactly one half of the globe. On the 23rd of November, this General Grant passed the 180th meridian, the antipodes of London. Of the 80 days he had, it is true, spent 52, and only 28 remained, but it must be remarked that if he had only gone halfway, according to the difference of meridians, he had really accomplished 2/3 of his journey. He had been obliged to make long detours, but had he followed the 50th parallel, which is that of London, the distance would only have been 12,000 miles, whereas by the caprices of locomotion he had actually been obliged to travel 26,000 miles, of which he had now finished 17,500. But now it was all plain sailing, and Fix was not there to interfere with him. It also happened on that day that Passepartout made a great discovery. It may be remembered that he had insisted on keeping London time with his famous family watch, and despised all other timekeepers on the journey. Now, on this day, although he had not touched it, his watch agreed exactly with the ship's chronometer. His triumph was complete, and he almost wished Fix had been there that he might crow over him. What a lot of falsehoods the fellow told me about the meridians, the sun, and the moon. Nice sort of time we should keep if we listened to such as he. I was quite sure that the sun would regulate itself by my watch one of these days. Passepartout did not know that if his watch had been divided into the 24 hours like Italian clocks, the hands would now show that it was 9 o'clock in the evening instead of 9 o'clock in the morning, that is to say, the 120th hour after midnight, which is the difference between London time and that of the 180th meridian. But this Passepartout would not have acknowledged even if he understood it, and in any case, if the detective had been on board, Passepartout would have argued with him on any subject. Now, where was Fix at that moment? Fix was actually on board the General Grant. In fact, when he reached Yokohama, the detective immediately went to the English consulate, where he found the warrant which had come by the Carnatic, on which steamer they thought he himself had arrived. His disappointment may be guessed, for the warrant was now useless, and an act of extradition would be difficult to cause Fogg to be arrested. Well, he thought, when his first anger had evaporated, if the warrant is no use here, it will be in England. The fellow is returning to his native land, thinking he has put the police off the scent. I will follow him, but I hope to goodness some of this money will be left. He must already have spent more than £5,000. However, the bank can afford it. So he made up his mind to proceed on the General Grant, and was actually on board when Mr. Fogg and Mrs. Alder arrived. He was surprised to recognize Passepartout in such a dress, but he quickly went downstairs to avoid explanation, and hoped, thanks to the number of passengers, that he would remain unperceived by his enemy. But that very day he came face to face with Passepartout. Passepartout, without a word, caught him by the throat, and greatly to the delight of the bystanders, who immediately made bets on the result, he proved the superiority of the French system of boxing over the English. Passepartout was much refreshed by this exercise. Fix rose in a very dishevelled condition, and asked his adversary whether he had quite finished. For the present, yes. Then let me speak to you. But it is all in your master's interest. Passepartout seemed conquered by the detective's coolness, and followed Fix to the forepart of the ship. You have given me a licking, said the detective. So far so good. I expected it, but just now. You must listen to me. Hitherto I have been playing against Mr. Fogg. I am now in his favour. Oh, then you believe him honest at last? By no means. I think he is a thief. Be quiet, hear me out. So long as Mr. Fogg was on British territory, I did all I could to detain him till the warrant for his arrest arrived. It was I who put the Bombay priests on your track. I hocussed you at Hong Kong. I separated you from your master and caused him to lose the Yokohama steamer. Passepartout clenched his fists as he listened. But now, continued Fix, Mr. Fogg appears likely to return to England. All right, I will follow him, but in future I will do as much to keep his way clear as I have done to prevent his progress. I have changed my game, and have done so for my own interest. Your interest is the same as mine, for it will be only in England that you will ever find out whether your master is honest or not. Passepartout listened attentively, and felt that Fix meant what he said. Are we friends? Asked Fix. Friends, no. Allies, yes, but only to a certain point, for at the least sign of treason, I will twist your neck. That's a bargain, said the detective calmly. 11 days afterwards, that is to say, on the 3rd of December, the General Grant entered the Golden Gate of San Francisco. Mr. Fogg had neither gained nor lost a day.